As mentioned, I've been with Star of the West for going on 35 years. I'm the non-miller of the group. Based in Frankenmuth. If you know anything about Frankenmuth, we're more renowned for Christmas ornaments and chicken dinners than we are wheat milling. But Star of the West has been in Frankenmuth since 1870. We have 2 flour mills in Michigan, Frankenmuth, Quincy, one in Ligonier, Indiana, one in Kent State University, a mill in Churchville, New York, and we're building our first brand new mill since 1910 in Willard, Ohio, so not too far away from here. So again, as mentioned, I spent my early years at Star of the West. I started out doing research, and I was hired for a specific duty, and I get into this. Just like you folks, we've had some issues, and the gentleman that hired me, he referred to we need to get an education on these things. So part of the education is getting diplomas. So my first diploma was in 1980, Sprouts. That picture Jay had, I can remember seeing those very vividly growing out of the heads of wheat. Oh, 1981, Sprouts. Not as bad, but still bad. Oh, 1996, vomitoxin. I went from doing work on sprout resistance to this newfangled animal called vomitoxin that, thank God, Pierce Paul wants to learn about. I'm just trying to deal with. 2004, first time we had vomitoxin and sprout, double barrel. And we switched to falling numbers, which for those in the milling industry that know about falling numbers, that's an interesting process when you go from an old system to a new system. Up 2008, sprout year again, all full falling number. Up 2009, sprout year again, back to back. So you folks that are in Ohio that are going through this, been there, done that. Up 2013, sprout and falling number. And a touch of vom. As 2014, sprout, falling number, and again, a little bit of vom. And then 2015, we had vomitoxin with a side of falling number. So lots of opportunities, and to all you guys in the room, when I got here, I wasn't sure, talking to the folks earlier, how many people would even be here, because when you got this many problems, why the hell do you want to grow wheat? Well, I'm not very good at selling chicken, and my dad won't let me back on the farm, which isn't true. But we do, at Star of the West, we do a lot of our own trials, and to kind of dovetail onto what Mark had talked about, these things are very general that I'm going to get to, but we do varietal trials, we do seed treatments, we do fertility, we do application techniques, fungicide use, herbicide, and really for about 35 years, I've been playing with different growth regulators. And the reason for that, again, one of my original projects was to improve protein in wheats. Now, in my part of the world, a lot of it is white wheat. The majority is white wheat. You guys are red wheat. By all accord, you folks should be growing better wheat. Reds, they're more available. Whites are kind of the stepchild of the wheat business. And speaking of stepchilds, one of our problems we have with farmers is they treat wheat like a stepchild. If you look at a farm magazine, you see the latest and greatest on corn planters, and I call them soybeans because we do a lot of dry beans. But soybean technologies and planting information, and boy, you got to get down there in the nitty and the gritty to find anything much on wheat. So in 2015, on our Star of the West plots, we combined all of our practices, and we averaged 117.9 bushels on our plots. And we had a half-mile east of our office, we had an exciting plot that was 145.7 bushel of white wheat. Of course, that was using Palisade, a growth regulator, and bumping the nitrogen rate from a normal about 90 pounds, and we were pushing it to 150. And by the way, if you get to 180, it'll go down on you. So FYI, the things I'm talking about, I'll be showing practices in terms of what it costs. So I'm not talking about dollars per acre. I'm going to talk about it takes this many bushels, and I expect to get this many bushels. Because I have a simple belief that goes back to every farmer I've worked with. I think about my dad, and I say, well, I want to use something that I'm not going to get at least what I put back into it. So I go to work every day knowing that there's some farmer out there that if I'm going to make a recommendation, he's counting on me to make sure that he's getting that that equivalent back, and of course better. So these are the wheat production tips. This is not intensive management, just management. And the first thing, and it's been, a lot of the things I'm talking about are, Jay touched on it earlier, Dr. Pierce, Paul talked about it, and to a certain degree, Mark. So when you talk about the fertility side of things, keep in mind your neighbors, your soils. I'm in the same boat. We're surrounded by water. We have to watch what we do every day too. But knowing your growth stages is very important. Making applications is very important to follow with your growth stages. First thing you got to do, though, if you're going to plant it, is seed treatments. Every year we get loads with smut. We get simple things that could be treated very easily with seed treatments. And this brand new treatment was 1970, and we still get guys, I wasn't going to plant wheat, and I decided, I'll just get some from a neighbor and plant it. Well, at least clean it and treat it. Start out right. That's really important to avoid other problems. I prefer in general, it costs about 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 bushels equivalent, and we've been averaging 4.5 to 6 bushel improvement by treating the seed. And I would certainly go with one of the Conazole treatments to help suppress the fusarium. Plant as early as possible. Dr. Paul talked about earlier the Hessian fly. Well, I've only seen the Hessian fly in captivity at the entomology lab at MSU. So I don't know what the thing really looks like out in the wild. But I know for about $1.298, I can take care of it. It's a problem. So if I have to err and planning a day early versus waiting for that perfect time, and I know they're looking at that, getting a good start is really imperative to good wheat production. And then I want to start out he was showing more like 1 1/4 or 1.25 to 1.5 million seeds early. Being in Michigan, our weather's probably a little harsher, so we're around 1.5 to 2 million seeds per acre. No farmer plants corn on a 1/4 bushel or 2 bushel or anything like that. We plant corn based on 30, 40,000 seeds per acre. We plant soybeans on pounds or seeds per acre. Wheat needs to be done the same way. And it's certainly important to know your germination. I see a lot of, and I know this is kind of very mundane, and that's the whole thing. Wheat isn't that complicated. You guys are saying, well, I knew that, but the common error is we'll plant some saved seed, some poor quality seed maybe. They don't know the germ and they won't plant it. So it's better to be a little bit heavy than not enough. And if you're still using the Van Brunt grain drill, that 1.5 inch placement is really critical. And yet I'll see these things floating around the countryside somewhere. They should have some flowers planted in them and call it good. But there's a point when this is going to come back and bite us, and I'll get back to that when we get into the spring side of this equation. Fertility, adequate fertility is very important, basic stuffs. Wheat needs nutrients. We get farmers, though, they'll say, you know what, price of corn's pretty cheap, soybeans cheap, I'm going to plant wheat, but it's just going to have to go it alone. I'm not going to spend the money on it. I'm going to save myself to prosperity. This here, believe it or not, those are, I don't know how much you see this in Ohio, but those are banded seed band placed from sugar beets from 2 years ago. And the guy didn't put any fertilizer on his wheat because it doesn't need it. And you can see right where the banders were on there. So it's still important to put that on there. It'll show up over and over again. Scouting, know what's in the field, how many tillers. Tillers are important to get optimum production. Winter weeds there, insects, those are where you do have to watch for aphids. The early plantings can be a problem, but scouting for aphids, a lot of the newer seed treatments have some control that you can add to it. Minimal cost. Tillering, managing the tillers is very important for wheat production. I've talked about that. This is done by nitrogen management. I'm a big proponent of splitting nitrogen, but I talk to the farmers and say, you know what, I don't like tracks, I don't have time, okay. So, but nitrogen does promote tillers. If I get to March and I want to put some nitrogen on, If my wheat is thin, I'm going to push the nitrogen. If I got it real thick, if we get planted in normal times, we get a lot of tillers, I'm going to back off that nitrogen. 4 to 6 tillers is really optimal. I'm kind of intrigued in Dr. Paul's wide row spacing wheat, what kind of tillers they're getting in that. I'll have to get back with him on that, but it's curious. So wheat needs nitrogen available upon breaking dormancy. Again, I prefer splitting to manage those tillers as well. But the cost of splitting is about $1.50 or $1.50, and our 10-year return average has been about 6.5 by taking the same nitrogen and putting some in March and some in around, depending, end of April, 1st of May. But if I'm going to do it, I'm going to use liquid and I'm going to use streamers. If you're going to go out there and just broadcast urea, you're going to burn it. If you use broadcast 28, you're going to burn it. That's not good. If you burn it, it'll grow back out of it. Farmers say, oh, it'll grow back out of it, but it clips yields. Herbicide applications. We all know you can't have weeds. And when you're doing a lot of no-till, we get weeds that didn't used to be weeds or problems. You could take care of them. So wheat is one thing. You got to manage that. We do a lot of underseeding with clover, so that causes us a little bit of problem. But taking care of the weeds is, and there's a whole assortment of things you can use. So I'm talking to a grower, well, all right, I'm going to go out there and spray with 2,4-D or Banville dicamba. It cost about a 3/4 bushel of wheat to pay for the 2,4-D. And you can use some of the newer products. Going to take a little over 2 bushel, 2 1/4, 2 1/2, Husky or Affinity, but they're a lot easier on the wheat. If I apply a 2,4-D or a dicamba, I'm going to lose about 9 to 10 bushels of wheat. And when a guy harvests the whole field, if he doesn't leave a check, he's going to say, hey, I had 90 bushel wheat. What's wrong with that? Well, from our replicated trials, you still cost 9 to 10 bushel year in and year out. Because the only real time to apply it, your 2,4-Ds, is back here when you're having, you're planting corn and maybe soybeans. But other than that, once it starts to joint, you start dinging the weed up. And whatever you do, you'll show it on the label, but don't put fertilizer with any of the herbicides. It's just a recipe for disaster. So now we're getting into that area that's been discussed, and I'm going to fly through this pretty quick. But I deal with a lot of farmers in what I do. I don't deal so much on the food customer side, but I do with the farmers. Normally, this is when I put on my Kevlar vest. And just remember, I have small children at home. All right, he's in his last year at the seminary, and she's a senior in college. But they're still small children. So the first question they get is, what is this vomitoxin? Why are you worried about it? Well, it's been talked about, and it's, 15 years ago, it was still new. But it's a problem. It's a deoxynivalenol. It gets in the wheat, it gets the name because it makes animals not healthy. So it's a human health issue. We have a spec to deliver against. Every mill in the country has to be within these tolerances. And these are the standards. Jay talked about it. It's not just Monell. It's not just Star of the West. We all have to comply. It's not optional. So where does it come from? Of course, that was talked about by Pierce Paul a bit too. He had a much more intricate schedule. But bottom line, you got to have 3 things. You got to have environment, usually rain. You have to have a host, wheat. And you have to have, there's our host, environment, this dreaded thunderstorms. And then the pathogen is corn. And if you go out in any last year's cornfield and you see these neat little brown spots on the corn stalk, right around May, they start fermenting. They do their thing, pop up. They come up in the sky. At night, it cools, and the spores come down. They land in the wheat heads. If it stays dry, no problem. If we get moisture, doesn't take much, they'll take off and grow. So that's what we need. The ambient temperature range is somewhere around 48 to 92. So if it gets anywhere between 48 and 92 in the last week or so of May, 1st of June, you have potential problems. So how do you prevent the problem? Well, corn stubble is mentioned about. I can show you time and time again. A guy will chop corn off for silage, plant wheat in there. It's convenient, it's open. You're gonna have a higher probability of planting or seeing vom show up there. No-till does play into it. There's no guessing about that. It adds to the problem. See it time and time again. Now, why didn't we have this years ago? Well, back when I was a kid, if I was plowing, moldboard plowing, and I left the corn stalk, my grandpa gave me hell for going too fast. So now we leave that on top so the dirt doesn't wash away. So that's part of the problem. But I think it's been around since Noah got off the ark. Talked about the risk assessment, looking at this. This is what, you guys have seen these. It helps, but the problem is we can build a pretty good case, probably don't need to spray, and then all of a sudden the weatherman changes his mind and it's going to rain on us. I am relieved that we can spray fungicides in the rain and still not lose everything, because we run into that all the time. So fungicides, we started out with Tilt. That lowers the amount of DON by about 4%. Folacure, that was our next generation, about 21%. And Prosaro is about 61% that we reduce. The problem is none of these are not silver bullets. They're not 100% eradication. So timing is really, really critical as far as making sure we just got to make up our mind. Are we going to spray? Are we not? This is from this year in my part of the world where we had known sprayed fungicide, and these are less than 2 and greater than 2. 98% of the guys that sprayed didn't have a problem. And you can say, well, why, if you spray, why do you have a problem? Well, because if you reduce it by 50%, if you had a four part per million to cut it in half, you're down only to 2. So again, we're not perfect. But where we didn't spray, we were well over 50% had VOM problems. So we can't outguess the weather. It helps to have a model to go from, but you still have to use your best judgment. So the cost to play a Prosaro type fungicide, including application, is about 5 bushels. So I've seen where we've had as much as 28 bushel increases, where we had a lot of disease pressure. In our 10-year average, we're a little over 10 bushel return, so it cost me 5, and on average I've got back 10. And the worst we ever had was in a drought, and that was 7 bushel. So it cost me 5 bushel to put it on, and let's say I got 7 bushel back. That's a little better than 1-to-1 return. I can live with that. And of course, then you get a year like this, the discounts just really take that number right out of the stratosphere. So in my opinion, what's to discuss? If you're going to plant it, plan on spraying it. You plan on putting nitrogen on in the spring. I know they do. I know farmers do. And you better, in my opinion, need to plan on taking care of it. So multiple application, for those that are more into intense, where we get into multiple application fungicides, since 2005, we've been averaging 17.75% increase. So that's about 19 bushel. We've increased our yields with using multiple applications. But I don't have all the detail because, well, I do, but I'm not going to bother with that today. So then you get into this. So I'm not so sure how accurate is this vomitoxin testing thing. I got a different number in the same field, and it's all the same variety planted at the same time. Well, part of it is you're talking parts per million. In this little illustration, the old gravity wagon, 1 part per million is 144 kernels in a gravity wagon. And if you get into a regular semi, about 1,200 bushel, that's 864 kernels equals 1 part. And that's out of, get back to my, 864 kernels is 1 part per million, and there's 864 million kernels in a typical semi. So it's a small, small number. So you're going to get some deviations. So we do replicated samples as well, but if you use the same sample, and I won't bother with crop insurance, but that sampling thing is another issue for another day, but we match up pretty well, and we go between all of our labs if you're using the same sample. But if you're pulling from a different part of the field, if you've ever gathered mushrooms out in the woods, they don't all grow evenly across the field or through the woods. And that's same with VOM. So now I'll get into the dreaded falling number, the sprout. So I get this all the time. How can my wheat sprout, it didn't get dry? Well, you got to understand there's a difference between mature or ripe, and how to understand this is wheat only, let me back up, wheat only sprouts if it's mature. With this in mind, the difference between dry and ripe is wheat is dry is 13.5 moisture, we know that. But it's about 28% is when it's actually physiologically mature. So it's much wetter. So the whole concept has been discussed, but going out after earlier, that's the key thing. It was discussed about how do we stop the sprouting process and the VOM issue. On average, about 16% moisture, you'll stop the growing of VOM and you'll stop the falling number process or the sprouting. You're converting from starches to sugars. So what happened? Well, of course, it rains. Fog is a bit of a problem for falling number, and we're learning too now that dews, we got a little study we're working on, and from one day to the next, we saw wheat go from, just with a simple dew, drop 15 to 20 seconds, 15 falling numbers from one day to the next, just with dew formation. So get after it as early as you can. Encourage the growers to get after it as early as they can. So sprouting, it's not days, it's hours. It's just a matter of hours. So then the next one. So where the hell did this newfangled falling number thing come from? My dad says that to me. I said, Dad, this is not a falling number machine. But the pertinent falling number machine that most of us use was first introduced in 1964. And it's been the primary instrument for doing a quick study on what the starch quality is. So what it does is we grind it up. For those that don't, we grind it up and put it into water, put it in a solution. We add a lot of heat. The wheat that's got good starch quality, the thick gets thicker. Put these little cool tubes down inside, and then there's a rod that falls. So in those plungers, when it gets to a certain temperature that drops, the plunger goes down. And when you see a falling number of 300 seconds, or 300, that means seconds. That's how long it took for that rod to go from the top to the bottom. And the falling number of water is 60. So when you have a farmer or neighbor say, my falling number of wheat was 40, well, water's 60, so why do you use falling number instead of counting sprouts? Well, first, counting sprouts is really subjective. We've got some long-term managers. If I laid this sample out and had Gary and myself and 10 other guys count it, we're going to come up with way different numbers. And besides that, it's meaningless. You can have 5% visible sprouts with 250 falling number, and you can have no visible sprouts with 180 falling number. So counting sprouts was handy back in the day, because that's the only tool people had was their eyes, but to flower quality, it's meaningless. Sprouting process, significant loss that actually, as mentioned, that happens way before you and I can see it. I mean, the last thing that happens in the sprouting process is for the tail to come out or the sprout to come out of the seed coat. So that's why mills have gone away from counting sprouts, because it doesn't really show up. And now we're learning the correlation between mylograph and falling numbers. There's some concern about how does that match up too. So again, I'm not so accurate. So the question is, on the accuracy of the falling number, it's the same field, the same wheat, and how come I get different numbers? Well, this goes back to that Van Brunt drill to a certain point. But if you look at this yield monitor from a combine taken, these are all different moisture levels. So within that moisture level, you get different maturity levels. So if you get the right rain in where the greener areas are, that was actually planted a little bit earlier by maybe a day or two. But even within the row, depending on planting depth and when that weed emerged, and it actually starts out, kind of look like this, and you can see some of the irregularities. That's that same field, and you can see this difference here. And so that was just a little bit later. The guy got rained out. He came back 2 days later and finished. Same field, you got all these different, these are all dug out. You have same plant, same variety, same field, but they're not the same. So they had different flowering. So in October it looked like this. March it looked like this. April it kind of started looking better again. You can see that the better part here where it was earlier, if you will. May it started to even up. We forget about the differences. And then you get to harvest, and then the guy says it's the same variety, the same field. Why is the number difference? Because it's not. And to go back to spraying fungicide, we want to hit 10.51. If anybody's ever scouted for 10.51 in a field like that, good luck. I'm glad to know that we got a 4 to 5 day kind of a window to work from. So it's a challenge to do that properly. So you may get some differences when you actually get it done. So the question is, what harm does low falling number cause? And Jay did a nice job of talking about it. These are the different things for cakes and batters, and I'll leave those things for the millers. But the point is, it's not just one milling company. We all have the same problem. In the case of sprouting, cookies, they get thin. Cookies on the right, mindful, we're selling to companies that make foods for people's kids. And grandma's really fussy about the grandkid. My mom, God bless her soul, my kids could do anything we couldn't do, but making sure the product was good was pretty important. They're the consumers. It's not the mills, it's the grandma, it's the wife, it's the people buying the product. So if it looks like this, we don't want it. Crackers break apart, pies and batters and on and on. It's been discussed. But things like a cake, my kids would like, you can put more frosting on this one, but to a baker that buys and their sells on aesthetics, it's really important. So that's where falling number comes in. You can't make a quality product. So of course, and this was touched on too, you're just going to blend this stuff off. You're going to whack me. You're going to steal my wheat because you can blend it off. And as mentioned, you can blend off FM and moisture and all those things. But if you take falling number and you think you can take equal parts and make white and red and make it all white, it ain't going to happen. Because one little drop of red goes a long way to being a problem. So kind of in summary, to grow wheat, this is the very streamlined version, but plant as early as you can. Get your seed population, at least 1.5 million seeds per acre. Please use a seed treatment. You're going to be happy you did. Try not to follow corn. And I know in agriculture it doesn't always work out like I think it ought to, like most of the time. But I know that your opportunity for problems is much greater if you follow corn. Use a starter fertilizer. Do your soil test. Do it right. I get all that. We do that every day. We do a lot of variable rate stuff. We got over 500 and some thousand acres that are gridded to do variable rates. So we really believe there's a place for that from a cost savings, but also to manage the crop. Get some nitrogen on it, green up. Ideally would be to do multiple applications. If you say, look, I'm not into that, I don't have time, consider a slow release nitrogen in part of your blends so it doesn't all wash out at the same time. We also need, for yield and protein qualities, you need a big chunk of nitrogen available at heading. That's really important. So if you can't do the methodology of splitting it, then consider some slow release nitrogen. That will help. And then really, please stay away from the 2,4-Ds and the dicambas. They're cheap, but they're costly. Doesn't cost much to put them on, but it's going to whack you on the production side. And then on the fungicide, I just look at, stay away from the strobies. If you say, look, I don't even want to spray a fungicide, but if you're going to do only one, do it at heading, 10.51, Caramba Prosaro, use one of those. It's just a good payback. And then early harvest as soon as you can. I like Manel's idea of offering some incentive to get the farmer going. I think it's a great idea. We do it ourselves in Michigan because we know farmers. So, and then last but not least, clean those trucks, combines, and grain bins before you put it in there. It is a food product, and there's a lot of four-legged fur-bearing creatures like to move inside of a combine for the winter. There's lots of food, shelter, but they're not much fun coming back out. So with that, thank you, and I don't know how much time we have for questions. Yes, sir.
Is there any sort of correlation when trying, if someone did attempt to blend falling numbers, so let's say you have equal parts of, say, 1,000 bushels of 300 falling number and you have 1,000 bushels of a 150 falling number, if you blend those equally, would you come out with something, say, like a 125 or 150?
If
or is it very
if you had 150 and 300 equal parts, you'd get about a 152.
Oh, wow, okay.
Nobody has all the reasons, but I can tell you, if we see it, farmers will, 5% will take that 300 and crash it. So if you had 1,000 of each, you've just created 2,000 of bad. Yes?
You're encouraging farmers to get out there earlier to harvest. What kind of maximum moisture are you recommending for farmers to go out there?
Ideally would be to start around 20. Now, mindful it's mature at 28, so the weather can, most of the big combines, the modern ones have enough horsepower, they can run it through. But when you go through a grain dryer, it depends how much you can hold of over 20 moisture, but it dries really hard. There's a big difference between 20 and 21. If you take a 6,000 bushel an hour dryer at 5 points removal, you'll just about cut that in half in that extra 1 point moisture. It just really, if you got elevators and you got guys run them and you get it that high, they're gonna hate you because it really slows it down. But the alternative isn't so good either. Yes, sir.
Yeah, did you ever see wheat becoming a contract crop where you contract the acres and have more control as a miller?
What do you think, Don? The question was, do I ever see wheat becoming a contract, like an acreage contract or production contract?
I'm not sure I do, because I think it'll become more like oats. You know, we used to raise oats in Ohio, now we import oats. So I think it'll be raised in other parts of the country and be imported. We'll pay a freight price before we'll pay a contract growing price.
The problem from my perspective, and I'm in a dry bean world where we do that. We do edible soybeans that way, and we do sugar beets that way in my world. But they've got a very distinctive customer on the other end. And as of right now, our customers in the food industry, I don't think are ready, at least today, to sign on to such a thing. So, yes, sir.
My take from this then is that we need to harvest, and I like to do it myself, at higher moisture. We need more incentives, and maybe you are doing them, but to me, I'm not getting to them incentives. Because I'm getting charged at the elevator. So maybe the mills and the elevator need to work together more, so this gets passed on to the producer, what I guess I'm trying to say.
I can't answer for the folks down here. In Michigan, it's pretty much unified that the elevators at a certain break, it's anywhere from 16 to 20 moisture, offer incentive drying on early harvest. And what does early mean? It's not really fixed to the calendar, it's fixed to the falling number. Because if you do an early harvest and you give it 3 days to get the guys out and going, that's one thing. But if the weather is such, just to touch on that a bit too, it was discussed it'd be nice to have earlier varieties, and I didn't mention it, but the safe bet is if you could get 2 or 3 varieties and have an early variety, a medium, and later, because what happens if the rains hit earlier? That's always a problem too. But we absolutely understand what you're saying too. We know the farmer's got a lot of risk in this thing. Yes, sir.
I've been told that the economic benefit to corn and beans that follow wheat or other small grains is enough to make up for whatever perceived loss of revenue there is in the wheat. Am I hearing right, or is this fable? Or is that true?
I've got a whole lot of data back in my office that I could share with you that would show where in a system there's some yield advantage to the corn or soybeans following wheat. And then if you look at your bushels per acre and you look at the 2016 futures, wheat's been not the prettiest girl to dance because corn has been so really nice and priced, $5, $6 corn. that catches a lot of eyes, but in today's market, we've kind of shifted back to where corn's not quite so attractive. So you put the wheat and the corn back in the mixture, I think wheat's going to find its place again. And it's hard coming off a couple of bad years where you have problems like this. Now, up in my world, I would say our growers probably averaged somewhere in the 95 to 100 range on the guys that are just planting wheat. And the guys that are doing the more intense stuff, we were averaging in the 115 to 20 range. You guys can do it down here. You've got the soils, you got the varieties. It's just a matter of putting the focus on there. There's just a few things. Look to the south, to Kentucky, those guys, that's where we stole a lot of our information from, the guys who stole it from the Brits. Wheat's not that hard to manage. It's just a matter of doing it and say, hey, I'm gonna grow this to make money, not I'm just gonna grow it to chop it and spread manure on it. So it's good to do that too, but you can make money in wheat. And my buddy that had 140 bushel, his biggest question is, why didn't we do this on the rest of the farm?